The year was 1864, and the American plains were not a place of peace. They were a place of fire. Settlers moved west in long, slow wagon lines, cutting through land that had belonged to the Lakota Sioux for generations. The United States Army moved with them, pushing further and further into territory that no treaty had honestly surrendered. On both sides, fear had curdled into anger. Anger had curdled into violence. And violence, once started, is very hard to stop. Margaret Whitmore was 17 years old when her world ended the first time. She had been born in Ohio, the eldest daughter of a minister and his quiet, steady wife. Her father believed in destiny. He believed that God had placed wide, open land in the West for people like them, people willing to sacrifice comfort for purpose. Margaret had grown up hearing that word, purpose, like a hymn sung at every meal. She had believed it, partly because she had no reason not to, partly because belief is easier when you have never had it tested. The Whitmore family joined a settler convoy in the spring, following the Platte River Trail toward what her father called a promised life. There were 11 wagons in their group. Families with children, with livestock, with wooden crates packed full of the small objects that make a life feel real: quilts, Bibles, iron pots, seeds for planting. Margaret's mother kept a small music box wrapped in cloth. She said it had been her own mother's. She said that wherever they were going, music would remind them of where they came from. They were 3 weeks into their journey when the attack came. Margaret would later struggle to describe what she saw. Not because the memory faded, it never faded, but because language did not hold enough room for it. She remembered smoke before she saw flames. She remembered the sound of horses before she saw riders. She remembered her father grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the underside of a wagon, his mouth moving in what she believed was prayer, though she could not hear a single word above the noise. The Lakota warriors moved through the convoy like a storm, fast, precise, and terrifying. This was not random violence. The army had attacked a Lakota winter camp 3 weeks earlier, killing elders and children while the warriors were away hunting. What Margaret witnessed was retaliation. The plains had its own mathematics of justice, and she was caught in the middle of it, unable to read the equation. When the smoke settled, 6 wagons had been destroyed. 4 settlers were dead, including Margaret's father. Her mother was badly injured, unconscious in the dirt with a wound to her side. Margaret herself had not been touched. She knelt in the ash and the silence, holding her mother's hand, certain that they would both be killed within the next few minutes. Instead they were taken. The warriors bound their wrists with leather cord, not cruelly but firmly, and placed them on horseback. Margaret counted 7 other captives from her convoy. Among them were 2 children, a young man named Thomas who had been hired to drive one of the wagons, and an older woman named Clara who had not stopped praying aloud since the attack began. Margaret looked at each of their faces. She saw the same thing in all of them, pure, bottomless terror. She felt it too. She was not going to pretend otherwise. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the horse's mane just to hold herself upright. Her throat had closed around all the words she wanted to say. Her mind was doing something strange, cycling rapidly between grief for her father and a cold, sharp survival instinct that she had never known she possessed. That instinct kept saying the same thing over and over like the tick of a clock. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. As the warriors led them north across the open grass, Margaret looked back once at the burning wagons. She saw the glint of something small in the dirt, her mother's music box, half buried in ash, still intact. She told herself it was a sign. She didn't know what kind. But she held on to it the way you hold on to anything when everything else is already gone. She did not know yet that the next chapter of her life would be unlike anything her father's God had ever described. She did not know that the man riding at the front of the column, tall, straight-backed, wearing a single eagle feather, was about to change everything she thought she understood about people, belonging, and what it truly means to be given a name. The journey north lasted 4 days. Margaret's mother, whose name was Ellen, drifted in and out of consciousness for most of it. The warriors had not left her to die in the dirt, which surprised Margaret deeply. One of the younger men, barely older than her, with careful eyes and quick hands, had cleaned and bound Ellen's wound using strips of hide and a poultice made from plants he gathered along the trail. He worked without being asked and without asking for thanks. Margaret watched him carefully. She was still terrified. But she was paying attention the way that cold instinct kept demanding of her. The Lakota camp appeared at dawn on the 4th day, rising out of the prairie mist like something from a different world. There were over 100 teepees arranged in a wide, deliberate circle. Fires burned low at the center. Dogs moved between the structures. Children appeared first, running toward the returning warriors with the kind of joyful energy that no amount of political complexity can suppress in small children. Women followed, greeting the men with restrained dignity, their eyes moving quickly to the captives. Margaret felt herself being studied. She tried not to look away. The captives were taken to a large teepee near the edge of the camp circle and left inside with water and dried meat. Clara had finally stopped praying and started crying instead, which somehow felt more human. Thomas, the wagon driver, sat with his knees pulled to his chest and said nothing at all. Margaret sat beside her mother, who was now awake but weak, and watched the entrance of the teepee with the focus of someone who understood that information was the only weapon she currently had. The camp's chief came to see them that evening. His name, she would later learn, was Tatanka Ska, White Buffalo. He was not what she expected, though she could not have said clearly what she had expected. He was perhaps 50 years old, with deep lines in his face that spoke of weather and thought rather than simply age. He moved without hurry. He sat across from the captives and looked at each of them slowly, the way a person looks at something important before making a decision. He spoke in Lakota, and a younger man beside him translated haltingly into English. He told them they would not be harmed. He told them they were guests, or something close to that word. The translator stumbled slightly, in his people's home. He told them that their situation would be decided by council, and that the council would take several days. Until then they would be fed and sheltered and expected to help with daily work in the camp. Margaret was the only one who asked a question. She asked what had happened to the other captives from the convoy, the ones she had not seen since the first day. Tatanka Ska looked at her directly when she spoke, even before the translation was finished, as if he could hear the shape of her meaning without the words. He told her, through the translator, that 3 had been released near a military fort 2 days south. 2 had been traded to another band in exchange for horses. He said this plainly, without apology or cruelty, the way a man states facts. Margaret nodded. She did not cry. She filed the information away. In the days that followed, life in the camp revealed itself to be nothing like the stories she had grown up hearing. Those stories had featured savagery as a central character, painted warriors, screaming chaos, mindless destruction. What she found instead was a community with its own deep logic. Women managed the domestic life of the camp with an authority that was quiet but absolute. Children were treated with enormous tenderness. The elderly were spoken to with deference. There was laughter. There were arguments. There were moments of boredom and moments of extraordinary beauty, like the evening when a group of young men sang together near the central fire and the sound rose into the darkening sky and seemed to stay there. Margaret worked. She was assigned to help a woman named Winona, who was approximately her mother's age and communicated almost entirely through demonstration and expression. Winona showed her how to scrape hides, how to carry water efficiently, how to keep a fire burning through the night without wasting wood. She was not unkind. She was also not soft. She corrected Margaret's errors without embarrassment and praised her improvements without ceremony. It was the most honest teaching Margaret had ever received. Her mother recovered slowly. The young warrior who had treated Ellen's wound, whose name Margaret learned was Chayton, continued to check on her daily. Ellen, for her part, was confused by this. She had expected hatred. She received something much more difficult to categorize, something that looked uncomfortably like care. Margaret lay awake each night and listened to the sounds of the camp. She thought about her father. She thought about the music box in the ash. She thought about the word purpose and how differently it sounded now inside her head than it had back in Ohio. She was trying to understand something large and shapeless that she didn't yet have the language for. She felt it pressing against the inside of her chest like a second heartbeat. She did not know that Tatanka Ska had been watching her work. She did not know that he had already spoken to the council about her. She did not know that in 3 days, he would call her to his fire and say something that would split her life cleanly into before and after. She just kept paying attention. The morning Tatanka Ska summoned her, the sky was the color of an old bruise, deep purple giving way to gray, then slowly, reluctantly to pale gold. Margaret had been awake before the sun. She had been awake most of the night if she was being truthful. Something in the air of the camp had shifted. People moved differently. Winona had looked at her that morning with an expression Margaret couldn't decode. Not pity, not warning, something more complicated than either. She followed the young translator across the camp circle to where Tatanka Ska sat beside his personal fire. 2 elders sat with him, men she recognized from daily life in the camp. One who carved wood with extraordinary patience. One who seemed to spend most of his time in conversation with the very old women near the east end of the circle. They acknowledged her arrival with brief nods. Tatanka Ska gestured for her to sit. The translator, whose English name he had told her once, was simply Joseph, sat to the side ready. There was a silence first. Not an awkward silence. A deliberate one. Margaret had learned by now that silence in this community was not empty. It held weight. It meant something was coming that deserved space. Tatanka spoke. Joseph translated carefully. The council had discussed the captives. Thomas and Clara would be escorted south and released near the army road. Ellen, Margaret's mother, would go with them. She was well enough now to travel, and Tatanka had given his word that she would reach safety. Margaret's hands went cold in her lap. She looked at Joseph to make sure she had understood. He nodded once. Then Tatanka continued. Margaret, he said, would stay. The ground shifted beneath her even though she was sitting still. She opened her mouth, closed it, found her voice somewhere small and pushed it out. She asked why. She asked what she had done. Tatanka did not answer immediately. He looked into the fire. When he spoke again, Joseph translated with unusual slowness, as if the words required careful carrying. He said that he had watched her for 12 days. He said he had watched many captives over the years, soldiers, settlers, traders, women, men, children, and that most of them moved through his camp like people moving through a bad dream, waiting only to wake up. They saw nothing. They learned nothing. They remained strangers even in the middle of life. He said Margaret was different. He said she looked at things the way people look when they are actually trying to understand, not simply endure. He said that was a rare thing and rare things should not be wasted. And then he said the part that stopped her breathing entirely. He said that he had a daughter who died 3 winters ago. Fever. She had been 16. She had been, he said, a girl who paid attention. He reached into the folds of his robe and removed a small, beaded bracelet, the kind of fine, careful work that Margaret had seen Lakota women spend hours on. He held it out across the fire. Joseph, quietly, told her it had belonged to his daughter. He told her that Tatanka was offering her something that had no direct translation in English. An adoption, but more than an adoption. A new name. His own name, marked with a small difference so that she would carry it as a member of his family but remain distinctly herself. She would be called Ska Winyin, white woman, but the way he said it, Joseph explained, was not a description of her appearance. In the context of his naming, Ska referred to the white of the sacred white buffalo. Something rare, something that arrived unexpectedly and changed the world simply by being in it. Margaret sat very still for a long time. Every reasonable thought she had said she should refuse. She was a prisoner, not a guest. This was not her world. Her mother was leaving without her. The army would come eventually. She should wait, keep her head down, survive. But she looked at Tatanka's face. She looked at the bracelet in his outstretched hand. She thought of her father, who had believed in purpose so completely that he had crossed half a continent for it. She thought of the music box in the ash. She thought of Winona teaching her to carry water without spilling, of Chayton treating her mother's wound without being asked, of the young men singing into the dark sky. She reached out and took the bracelet. She put it on her wrist without speaking. Tatanka watched her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite grief. Something in between, like the sky at that exact moment when night becomes morning and you cannot say with certainty which one it still is. Outside, somewhere in the camp, a child laughed. The sound rose up and scattered like birds. Margaret, Ska Winyin, sat with the fire between her and the chief who had just made her his daughter, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that purpose was not a destination. It was a way of looking at the world while you were already inside it. The weeks that followed the naming were the hardest and strangest of Margaret's life, and also, in ways she could not yet fully admit, the most alive she had ever felt. Saying goodbye to her mother had been its own kind of grief. Ellen had wept openly, gripping Margaret's hands at the edge of the camp, begging her to come south. Margaret had held her mother's face and memorized it. She had said, with more steadiness than she felt, that she would be all right, that she would find a way to send word. That love did not require the same roof. Ellen had finally let go, climbed onto the horse the warriors provided, and ridden away without looking back, because looking back, Margaret understood, would have destroyed her. Thomas had not said goodbye at all. He had avoided Margaret's eyes since the morning of the announcement, as if her choice to stay was a thing he could not reconcile and so preferred to pretend was not happening. She did not blame him. She had her own doubts, surfacing at night like things coming up from deep water, cold and shapeless and hard to push back down. But she had made her choice, and now she lived inside it. Winona's attitude toward her shifted after the naming, not dramatically but noticeably, the way light shifts when a cloud moves. She began teaching Margaret things beyond basic camp work. She taught her to read weather by watching the grass and the birds. She taught her how the Lakota tracked game, not just the physical signs, but the logic of animal movement and habit. She taught her words, not just the names of objects but the names of concepts, relationships, feelings. The Lakota language was not simple, but it had an internal consistency that Margaret found beautiful once she stopped approaching it as something foreign and started approaching it as something to genuinely know. Tatanka gave her space. He did not crowd her with expectation or demand that she perform her new identity in public ways. He simply allowed her to exist inside the community and find her own edges. Occasionally he would walk with her in the early morning before the camp was fully awake, and they would move along the river in a companionable quiet that required no translation. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he didn't. She began to understand slowly that this was how he had loved his daughter, not with noise and ceremony, but with steady, present attention. She thought about that a lot. She had grown up with a father who expressed love through grand declarations. The move west, the promise of a better life, the language of purpose and destiny. Tatanka expressed love the way Winona taught, through demonstration, through patience, through showing up again the next morning and the morning after that. She also thought about what she had been told about the Lakota before she ever met one. The stories she had grown up with, the ones that circulated through Ohio towns and Sunday church meetings and newspaper columns, painted these people as creatures driven purely by violence and instinct, as obstacles to civilization rather than as a civilization themselves. She had believed those stories because she had no counter-evidence. Now she was living inside the counter-evidence every single day. She was not naive about it. She had seen the attack on the convoy. She had seen what war looked like. She understood that the Lakota were capable of violence, but she also understood, increasingly, that violence had a history and a context, that no group of human beings becomes capable of it without something first being done to them. The army had attacked first. The army kept attacking. She had seen the faces of the warriors when they returned from raids, not triumphant, not joyful, but tired in the way people are tired when they have had to do something they would rather not have done. One evening, Chayton found her sitting at the edge of the camp, looking south. He sat beside her without invitation, which surprised her. He was usually formal. He spoke in careful, quiet English, far better than she had realized he possessed, enough that she understood he had been holding it back by choice, watching her first. He told her that his family had lived in this territory for more generations than he could count. He told her that when he was a child, there had been no army roads, no wagon convoys, no negotiated boundaries. He told her that every year the world his people had known grew smaller. He said it without bitterness, or at least without the kind of bitterness that wants something from you. He said it the way people state geography, as simple, physical, inarguable fact. Margaret told him she was sorry. She said it as simply and as genuinely as she could. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Not with forgiveness, that was not what she was asking for and not his to give anyway. Just with acknowledgement. The kind that says, I believe you mean what you're saying and that is worth something. She wore the bracelet every day. She did not take it off to sleep. She was not performing loyalty. She was simply finding, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not want to. The plains were beginning to feel, against all reason, like home. Winter came the way winter always comes on the plains, without apology and without delay. The camp moved south and west, following the patterns that had governed Lakota life for centuries, shifting with the season and the game. Margaret moved with it. By now she was no longer being watched the way she had been in the beginning. She was simply part of the rhythm of the place, one more person carrying wood and water and knowledge from one day to the next. She had not lost herself. That was important to understand about what had happened to her. She had not forgotten Ohio or her father's voice, or the smell of her mother's cooking, or the particular quality of light through a church window on a winter Sunday. She carried all of it. It lived in her the way old music lives, not always heard but always present, part of the structure of things. What had changed was the size of what she held alongside it. She could now hold two truths at once without either one destroying the other. She could love what she came from and still belong to where she was. She could mourn her father and still be grateful for the man who had chosen to call her his daughter in her father's absence. She could understand that the world she had been raised to see as civilized had done terrible things to the people she now lived among, and she could understand that the people she now lived among had done terrible things in return, and she could hold all of that without collapsing into simple answers. Simple answers had never actually helped anyone. She was only beginning to understand how long it had taken her to learn that. In the deep cold of January, a rider came into camp from the east. He was Lakota from a neighboring band and he carried news. The army was moving north in larger numbers than before. New orders, new commanders, new pressure. There were rumors of a major campaign come spring, a push to force remaining Lakota bands onto the reservation boundaries that the government had been insisting on for years. The camp council met through 2 full nights. Margaret was not part of those discussions. But she listened to the camp around her, the way it changed in texture when fear entered it, the way adults spoke more quietly and held their children a little closer. Tatanka Ska came to her the morning after the second council meeting. He sat with her by the fire and spoke slowly. Joseph was not present this time. By now, Margaret's Lakota was sufficient for a real conversation, though it still had gaps and rough edges that made her occasionally reach for gestures to complete her meaning. Tatanka Ska was patient with it the way he was patient with most things. He told her what was coming. He did not soften it. He said that by spring the situation would be very dangerous. He said that a young woman with her background, with her language, her knowledge of both worlds, could do something that most people in this conflict could not do. She could be understood by both sides. He said he was not asking her to leave. He said he was not asking her to stay. He said that what he was telling her was that she had a choice, and that whatever she chose, she would remain his daughter. The word choice struck her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. She thought about it for a long time. Days, in fact. She walked the river trail that she and Tatanka Ska had walked so many early mornings. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist, worn smooth now from months of daily use. She thought about her mother. She had received word, through a roundabout path of traders and messages, that Ellen had made it safely to a settlement and was living with distant relatives. Alive. She was alive. She thought about Chayton, who had treated her mother's wound without being asked. She thought about Winona, who had taught her to carry water without spilling. She thought about Tatanka Ska sitting across a fire with a bracelet in his outstretched hand, seeing in a frightened captive girl something worth naming. She made her choice. She went east in early March when the snow began to break. She went not as a former prisoner returning to her own people, but as something much harder to describe, a person who belonged to 2 worlds and was finally ready to use that belonging for something real. She carried letters she had written, in both English and her rough Lakota, describing the camp, the people, the complexity of what was happening on those plains. She carried them to journalists, to church groups, to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear a young woman say, "These people are not what you have been told they are." Most of them did not listen. Some of them did. History does not record her name in its official documents. The story of Ska Winyan, the white woman who was given a Lakota chief's name and chose to carry it, lived in letters and oral accounts, in the memories of people who were present for parts of it. Small things. But small things placed carefully changed the shape of large ones. She wore the bracelet for the rest of her life. When people asked about it, she told them the truth, that a man she had every reason to fear had looked at her instead of through her, had seen something worth naming and had named it. That this was the most radical act of kindness she had ever witnessed. That it had remade her completely. And when they asked what name he had given her, she said it plainly in Lakota, the way he had first said it across the fire. Ska Winyan. White woman. Rare thing. Something that arrives unexpectedly and changes the world simply by being in it. She was proud to carry it. She carried it all the way to the end.